For decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran has operated with the patience of a regime that never forgets and the reach of an adversary that never truly backs off. This is not a government that confines its ambitions to its own borders. It has built an international playbook rooted in proxy warfare, covert operations, intimidation, and strategic deniability. From the Middle East to Europe to the United States itself, Iran has shown again and again that it is willing to test the limits of what its enemies will tolerate, and it has done so with a chilling consistency. The record is not hidden. It is scattered through indictments, intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, terror designations, and years of national security warnings that paint the same basic picture. Iran does not need a conventional war to threaten the United States or its allies. It prefers the shadows. It prefers networks, intermediaries, proxies, shell companies, covert operatives, cyber teams, and deniable violence. It prefers the kind of pressure campaign that can be dialed up or down depending on the political moment. And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Americans were reminded of that reality in 2011 when the U.S. Justice Department announced a shocking plot involving Iranian agents and the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. According to the indictment, the plan envisioned a bombing at a public restaurant in Georgetown, an attack that could have killed not just a foreign diplomat, but scores of civilians in the nation's capital. That one case alone should have destroyed forever the comforting fiction that Iran's operations are somebody else's problem, something contained overseas, something distant. It was a reminder that Tehran's reach could extend directly into the United States with lethal intent. Then came more warnings, more plots, more attempted hits, more cyber activity, more evidence that Iran and the networks tied to its security apparatus were not retreating, not moderating, not stepping back. In 2022, the Justice Department charged a member of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with plotting to murder former National Security Advisor John Bolton. The allegation was stunning not simply because of the target, but because of what it represented. A foreign state-linked actor allegedly trying to arrange a killing on American soil as a form of retaliation and deterrence. Not a theoretical threat, not abstract hostility, a targeted murder plot. And that is the point people keep missing. Iran's strategy has never depended on matching the United States plane for plane or ship for ship. Its doctrine is asymmetry. It uses what it has: militias, smugglers, front companies, intelligence handlers, sympathetic proxies, cyber intrusions, covert facilitators, disinformation, coercion, intimidation, patience. It forces stronger nations to defend everything, everywhere, all at once, while it only needs to find a few weak spots and exploit them. That is why professional counterintelligence matters so much. Not performative toughness, not cable news bravado, not empty slogans about strength. Actual, disciplined, technical, grinding counterintelligence work. The kind of work that is invisible when it succeeds and catastrophic when it fails. The kind of work that depends on expertise, language skills, pattern recognition, institutional memory, and people who know the target so deeply that they can recognize danger before it becomes a headline. Inside the U.S. national security system, there are units built specifically for that mission. Specialists whose entire job is to understand threats like Iran's not in broad, generic terms, but in operational detail. The money channels, the coded language, the proxies, the logistics, the shell entities, the familiar names that keep reappearing in new plots, the old methods hiding inside new fronts. That specialized focus is not a luxury. It is the whole point. Because when you are dealing with an adversary like Iran, general awareness is not enough. Broad competency is not enough. You need people who can look at a single suspicious financial transfer and immediately understand the network behind it. You need analysts who know when an ordinary-sounding phrase in an intercept is actually code for something much more dangerous. You need investigators who know which middleman matters, which courier matters, which company in Dubai matters, which contact in Turkey matters, which consultant is actually part of a covert support chain. You need a system that treats specialization as essential, not optional. And that is why the reported dismantling of the FBI's Iran-focused counterintelligence capability is so alarming. According to the material in this script, key personnel from the Bureau's elite Iran unit were purged, reassigned, or pushed aside in what current and former officials described not as a normal reorganization, but as a devastating hollowing out of expertise. Over a dozen senior personnel with decades upon decades of combined experience were reportedly removed from the very place in the U.S. security apparatus designed to monitor, disrupt, and neutralize Iranian operations. These were not interchangeable bureaucrats. These were specialists, linguists, financial investigators, veteran analysts, case officers who understood the Iranian target set at a professional depth that takes years, even decades, to build. And that is where this story stops being a story about office politics and starts becoming a story about national vulnerability. Because if you take a specialized team focused on one of the most persistent state-backed threat actors on Earth, and you strip away its core expertise during a period of rising tension, you are not streamlining. You are not modernizing. You are not making government more efficient. You are taking a deliberate risk with real consequences. You are betting that experience can be replaced overnight, that institutional memory does not matter, that junior personnel can improvise what veterans spent careers learning, and that adversaries will politely wait while your bureaucracy experiments with its own defenses. They will not. The professionals inside these systems understand something political appointees often do not. Intelligence work is cumulative. It is layered. It depends on continuity. The analyst who has followed a financial facilitator for 8 years does not just possess data. That analyst possesses instinct. The case officer who has watched how a hostile network changes methods over time does not just know facts. That officer knows patterns. And patterns are often the first warning that a threat is moving from background noise to operational danger. When that kind of expertise gets broken apart, you do not just lose manpower. You lose context. You lose velocity. You lose trust chains. You lose working relationships. You lose the people who know which lead is real and which is a decoy. You lose the quiet confidence that comes from having adults in the room who have seen the playbook before. According to the script, this purge happened at precisely the wrong time, during a period when intelligence chatter related to Iranian activity was reportedly increasing. Communications were intensifying. Threat streams were growing more active. Potential targeting of U.S. officials and infrastructure was becoming a larger concern. And yet, at the same moment that the environment demanded more precision, more continuity, and more discipline, the apparatus built to provide exactly that was being broken apart. That is the kind of decision that looks manageable on paper and disastrous in reality. Because a threat environment does not pause while leadership indulges in ideological theories about flattening structures and turning specialized units into generalist pools. The threat keeps moving. The money keeps moving. The handlers keep communicating. The assets keep probing. The hostile networks keep testing response times and looking for seams. They do not care about managerial fashion. They do not care about political branding. They care about whether the people watching them are competent, coordinated, and experienced enough to stop what comes next. And according to the details in the script, the answer to that question grew much less certain. The most damning part of this story is that the operational fallout reportedly showed up almost immediately. Raw intelligence was still coming in, but the connective tissue was breaking down. Seasoned Farsi-speaking analysts who could decode context were reassigned. Specialists who knew the Quds force ecosystem were moved elsewhere. Referrals that should have landed with experts bounced between desks. Money trails that should have triggered urgent escalation went cold. Signals that once would have been understood in hours reportedly sat unresolved for days. This is what institutional degradation looks like in practice. Not one dramatic explosion. Not one cinematic collapse. A series of delays, gaps, misreads, handoffs, and missed opportunities that cumulatively make the country less safe. And the deeper outrage here is that if the script is accurate, all of this unfolded while the public was being reassured that everything was under control. That is what makes the contrast so infuriating. On camera, the message is calm confidence. America is protected. Our deterrence is strong. The system is working. We have the best professionals in the world. But off camera, according to the sources reflected in this script, those same professionals were watching critical capability get stripped away in real time. They were watching specialized desks turned into generic ones. They were watching warnings dismissed as outdated thinking. They were watching a threat architecture built over years treated like a disposable nuisance because somebody in leadership decided deep expertise looked too insular. That is not leadership. That is delusion with consequences. And the script pushes the argument even further by tying this dismantling to a broader leadership style, one allegedly driven less by seriousness of purpose than by ego, optics, and personal vanity. It describes an FBI director more invested in image than mission, more attentive to appearances than to the threat matrix, more willing to spend on executive comforts than on frontline capability. It paints a portrait of a person who sees elite operational teams not as scarce national assets, but as props whose instincts lean toward showmanship over stewardship. Now, even if you take those details as part of the script's rhetorical framing, the larger accusation lands because it connects directly to the policy choices described. A leader does not need to openly confess contempt for specialization in order to show it. The contempt shows up in the decisions. It shows up when experienced officers are pushed out. It shows up when mission-specific units are diluted. It shows up when warnings are brushed off as relics of a legacy mindset. It shows up when the people who understand the threat best are treated like obstacles rather than safeguards. And once that mentality takes hold, the damage does not stay confined to one office or one unit. Because the broader fear laid out in the script is that the Patel case is not an isolated fiasco. It is a template, a model for what happens when politically driven management collides with professional security institutions. First, a mission-critical function is reframed as bloated or obsolete. Then specialists are recast as parochial. Then expertise is broken up in the name of efficiency. Then loyalists and generalists are elevated. Then the public is told this is a modernization effort. Then the agency loses its ability to do the very thing it was built to do. That is a terrifying pattern if it becomes normalized, especially in intelligence, law enforcement, and cyber defense. Because these institutions are not protected by press releases. They are protected by competence. They are protected by the boring, disciplined, deeply unglamorous work of professionals who know what they are doing. Once you start replacing that with ideology, patronage, vanity, or message management, you are no longer governing a security apparatus. You're staging one. And staged competence is worse than incompetence because it creates the illusion of readiness while the underlying systems decay. The script makes that case by widening the lens beyond the Iran desk. It points to attrition in other intelligence components, politicized filtering of analytical products, and the risk that agencies like CISA could be redirected away from genuine cybersecurity defense toward domestic narrative management. That concern is not just bureaucratic. It is strategic. Every minute a cyber analyst spends chasing partisan priorities instead of hostile intrusions is a minute ceded to adversaries. Every time a foreign threat assessment is softened, delayed, or rewritten to fit political comfort, the decision makers receiving it are being blinded. Every time allied intelligence services start doubting whether the United States can handle shared information professionally, the country loses something harder to restore than money: trust. And trust in intelligence is oxygen. Allies share because they believe what they give will be handled responsibly. Sources talk because they believe the professionals on the other end know how to protect them and act on what they provide. Analysts speak candidly because they believe their work will not be filtered through ideological loyalty tests. Once that confidence erodes, the damage spreads in directions the public rarely sees. Sources go quiet. Liaison relationships weaken. Warnings arrive later. Conclusions become less reliable. Systems that look intact from the outside are quietly starving on the inside. That is why so many former intelligence and military officials quoted or paraphrased in the source material sound less angry than alarmed. They are not describing a partisan disagreement. They are describing a breakdown in the habits that make serious national security possible. They're describing a situation in which the people who spent careers preventing the worst outcomes can see those outcomes becoming more likely, not because the threat suddenly became new, but because the institutions meant to contain it were deliberately destabilized. And the cruel irony is that the public often does not recognize the value of those institutions until after failure. Nobody throws a parade for the plot that never happens. Nobody cheers the analyst who noticed the pattern in time. Nobody sees the painstaking financial mapping, the intercept interpretation, the quiet source meeting, the patient cross-agency coordination that prevents a dangerous operation from maturing. Success in this world is usually invisible. Failure is not. Failure arrives with hearings and headlines and funerals and commissions and the unbearable hindsight of all the warnings that were available before the disaster. That is why the script's repeated comparisons to pre-9/11 institutional complacency hit so hard. The fear is not that one personnel change automatically produces catastrophe. The fear is that a culture of contempt for expertise creates the exact conditions in which catastrophe becomes easier to miss, easier to enable, and harder to stop. It is the fear of blind spots widening while leadership insists vision has improved. It is the fear of political theater replacing professional seriousness at the exact moment serious adversaries are watching for weakness. And make no mistake, adversaries do watch. They watch staffing turmoil. They watch public messaging. They watch interagency conflict. They watch turnover. They watch budget priorities. They watch how quickly warnings are acted on. They test systems. They study seams. They exploit vanity and confusion the same way a skilled burglar studies a neighborhood before deciding which house has the weakest lock. The idea that the United States can publicly degrade specialized counterintelligence capability and hostile states will somehow fail to notice is laughable. Of course they notice. That is the opening they wait for. Which brings us to the central truth at the heart of this entire script. A country cannot afford to treat national security professionalism as optional. Not when confronting a regime like Iran. Not when proxy networks span continents. Not when covert action, cyber sabotage, targeted retaliation, and deniable violence are already part of the operating environment. Not when intelligence timelines are collapsing, ally confidence is fraying, and experienced officers are warning that what is being lost cannot quickly be rebuilt. Because rebuilding is the part the political class always underestimates. You can fire or reassign a veteran in a day. You cannot recreate 20 years of expertise in a quarter. You can flatten an organizational chart with a memo. You cannot flatten complexity in the real world. You can pretend specialization is elitism. You cannot pretend away the consequences when nobody in the room knows how to interpret the warning signs in front of them. You can say the system is streamlined. But if what you have really done is remove the people who understood the system, then all you have streamlined is the path to failure. And that is why this story matters beyond any one name, any one office, or any one administration. It is about whether institutions built to protect the public are being governed by people who respect what those institutions are actually for. It is about whether the United States still understands the difference between optics and readiness, between message discipline and operational discipline, between political loyalty and professional competence. It is about whether we are serious enough to recognize that when experienced officials start saying the same thing over and over, that the adults are being pushed out, that expertise is being hollowed out, that the warning systems are degrading. We should probably listen before the cost of ignoring them becomes irreversible. Iran is not a hypothetical threat. It is not a talking point. It is a patient adversary with a long operational memory, a wide network of proxies, and a demonstrated willingness to target critics, officials, dissidents, infrastructure, and civilians through whatever channels it can exploit. The appropriate response to that reality is not improvisation wrapped in swagger. It is disciplined, non-political, deeply professional counterintelligence and national security work. Anything less is an invitation to disaster. And if the claims in this script are even substantially true, then what we are watching is not mere dysfunction. It is the willful dismantling of one of the very capabilities designed to keep that disaster from arriving. That should terrify every American, no matter their party. Because foreign threats do not care who you voted for. Missile sites do not care who won the messaging war this week. Hostile cyber teams do not care which faction got the better soundbite. A terror facilitator moving money through a shell network does not stop to ask whether the analyst tracking them is conservative or liberal. Reality is indifferent to ideology. And reality has a habit of punishing unserious leadership with extraordinary cruelty. The professionals know that. The veterans know that. The allies know that. The adversaries certainly know that. The real question is whether the people in charge know it too, or whether they will go on hollowing out the machinery of national defense while telling the public to sleep soundly. Because history is full of governments that mistook performance for preparedness right up until the moment they were forced to learn the difference.